John Nelson Darby, who actually was a great Bible teacher, started this in the 1800s. No, that's not true. So let me read to you what Irenaeus said, who lived AD 130 to 203. He was discipled by Polycarp, who was discipled by the Apostle John. Wow. He says, and therefore, when in the end the church will be suddenly caught up from this, suddenly caught up, then it is said there will be tribulation such as not been from the beginning. So he's teaching on a catching away of the bride. Yeah. Okay. And then the tribulation. All right. And if you look at the book of Revelation, I mean, the first four seals, yes. 2 billion people are put to death. Okay. Then we've got Victorinus. He wrote, the wrath of God always strikes the obstinate people. And these shall be in the last time when the church shall have gone out of the midst. And then the most convincing to me is this one. This is Ephraim, the Syrian. For all the saints and elect of God are gathered prior to the tribulation that is to come and are taken to the Lord, lest they see the confusion and the great tribulation coming upon the unrighteous world. There's 3 early church fathers in the first 3 centuries. They wrote about it. Yep. So Darby didn't invent it. He resurrected what they taught, and he resurrected what the Bible teaches, because I got 6 points showing you in Scripture. Now, I'm just going to be bluntly honest. My wife doesn't even agree with me. Is that right? And we joke about it. Okay. Because this is not something to divide over. Right. It's not something to argue about. Mm-hmm. Do you know what Paul said? Comfort one another with these words. But I find the way it's presented, it terrifies people. Yeah. It's totally opposite from what Paul says. Tribulation. Jesus said, in this world, we're going to have tribulation. There have been more people put to death for their faith in Christ in the last 100 years than all 1900 years put together of the church age. More. The tribulation is the world's wrath against believers. The tribulation, capital T, is God's wrath against a sinful world. So what's God going to do? Beat us all up and then say, okay, let's go eat dinner. Let's have a wedding feast. My bride? Yeah. He's going to catch the bride away. I believe during that 7 years is the judgment seat of Christ. I believe during that 7 years is the wedding supper of the Lamb. And then he's going to come back according to Zechariah, to Jude, to Enoch, with 10,000s and thousands of his saints on white horses.
Oh, wow. Well, I guess there you go. Right? This guy was pretty convincing. Except Irenaeus didn't teach that. The other 2 he mentioned are later, and they weren't apostles or students of Polycarp, who was the disciple of John. Irenaeus, though, if he said something, I would give it a lot of weight, since he was a direct disciple of Polycarp and John. But I asked AI, did Irenaeus, the church father, say the church will be caught up and then the tribulation? And they say no. Irenaeus did not teach a pre-tribulation rapture, the church being caught up before the tribulation. While he used phrases about the church being caught up, he believed the church would remain on earth to face the Antichrist and endure the tribulation before being gathered to Christ at the second coming. Irenaeus' eschatology, facing the Antichrist, in his writings, Irenaeus, a prominent 2nd century bishop, made it clear that he expected believers to go through the final period of persecution under the Antichrist, who would reign for 3.5 years. Not 7, as I've been saying. 3.5 years is the tribulation. This modern idea that it's going to be 7 years is a complete... it would be fine if some people misunderstood it and that's what they thought. But everybody has said that it's a 7-year tribulation, and I don't know where they get it. over and over and over and over and over in Daniel and in Revelation. And Matthew 24 and stuff indicates and shows this, that the tribulation is from when the abomination is seen standing in the holy place. And Daniel's very clear that there will only be 1,260 days and 75 more days, 1,335 days. The whole 1,335 days is the whole thing we have to endure. That's it. And then happy and holy is he that arrives at the 1,335 days. That's a little over 3.5 years, actually. And I don't even know for sure what happens at the end of the 1,260 specifically. The last 75 days could be that we are raptured, but in that sense that the Bible says, not some whoop, we're just caught up in the air individually, but the Bible says in chariots to meet the Lord, because he's coming with the saints that have already died, for they will not precede those that have fallen asleep in death. So the Great Tribulation, number one, is 3.5 years, period, not 7. Historically, the broader consensus among the early church fathers was a post-tribulation view. The idea that the rapture resurrection happens after the tribulation. To dig deeper into the actual patristic text, you can check out this comprehensive scholarly analysis. So while that verse is kind of misquoted that this man used, other places that Irenaeus speaks about this, he definitively explains that it will be a post-tribulation rapture, or after the tribulation. But as compelling as that information is, and I would love to do a whole video on that, but I just wanted to briefly mention that. What I really want to talk to you today about is definitively the most fascinating. I'm not saying it's the most important. I mean, if you had to pick a subject, it's not the most important. Salvation is the most important topic in the Bible. And there are things that are not necessarily the most important, but are the most interesting. There are things that are the most fascinating. There are things that are the most comforting, as that particular thing we just talked about is comforting to me. Because while the Bible doesn't teach a pre-tribulation rapture, what it does teach is that we will not be part of this wrath that's coming. We will not endure the wrath of deity as the rest of the world will, because remember, the tribulation is the Lord's plagues upon the world for their unrepentant ways. And remember, the Lord disciplines those whom he loves. The Lord himself would never just go and beat somebody for no reason. Now think about it. If these people are going to go into everlasting damnation or something, for everlasting eternal punishment, which the Bible categorically does not teach, that would be illogical from a loving deity, a loving father. If we're all his children, he wouldn't torture us forever and ever. That's ridiculous. It doesn't say that. The forever and ever is the ages, or the age, which is the age that we've been through, which is we're about to graduate from. So we'll have immortality. But if you don't have immortality, you get the resurrection unto judgment, which is the resurrection that brings you back so that you pay for what you've done. You live another life like reincarnation. But we're not appointed under the wrath because we're in Christ. There's no condemnation those in Christ. And Revelation twice says, in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, it says that the 10 days of trial, he will keep us from it. And the test that's coming upon the entire world, he will keep us from it. So that is beyond a doubt. But it doesn't mean that we're going to be raptured. It means that if you really read the Bible, and most people haven't read it all the way through and don't understand that the entire book of Psalms is a love letter to us. The epistles are all written to us, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. All the prophets wrote and warned us, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. And therefore, if you specifically, I love the book of Psalms. It describes in detail everything that we're going to go through. And the saints will be in the wilderness. They will have gotten out of Babylon because they obeyed the Lord. Get out of Babylon, my people, if you do not want to share with her in her sins and partake of her plagues. We're not going to partake of her judgments or her plagues. And this word plague is throughout the Psalms. Thousands at our left hand, 10,000s at our right hand, but it will not come nigh unto us. We will not see the plagues. They will not come near to us. We'll have a table prepared for us in the wilderness. It's odd to me that people have been quoting Psalms 23 for many, I guess, 1,000 years, just as a little poem like, oh, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh my soul to lie down in grassy pastures. Well, wait a minute. Why isn't that always the case? We're not always lying down in grassy pastures, because it's a specific prophecy of a specific time that he will lead us. Though the valley of shadow that's coming upon the world, we will not participate. We will obey the Lord, get out of Babylon, be no part of it. And even though it means to physically leave the cities, because you can't be no part of Babylon and be in the cities and participating with them. That's why you're going to share with her in her sins and partake of her plagues. But the primary thing. So remember this, all of you who say, well, I can't get out of the city because I don't have the money and all of this. Well, if that's truly the case, you're literally trapped in a basement somewhere in the city. The most important thing, the only thing you have to worry about is your heart. If you have left Babylon and do not participate in her works, meaning you do not watch her evil, violent porn, you do not watch her evil, corrupt garbage, you do not participate in the lawyers and the doctors, in the nursing, in the evil system. You're not a social worker grabbing people's children. You're not raping and pillaging. You're not selling drugs. You're not part of the pharmaceutical companies. You've gotten out of the chemicals and all the garbage. And you're not a politician. And you're not lying and following after man like Donald Trump, right? With a badge of Trump on your lapel or something, going around adoring Trump and putting your trust in man, in whom no trust belongs. Then the Lord himself will provide a way. Remember, Lot was taken by the angels outside of the city by the scuff of his neck, but it was his wife that turned back, and she didn't just look back, she turned back and started going back. So as long as you want to be out of the world, the Lord will provide the way. But don't be complacent. Get out. Do the best you can to get out. I mean, if you have no money, that doesn't mean, well, I can just stay in the city then. It means that you might be waiting at the moment for a little money so you can get out, right? But if you see that the walls of Jerusalem are collapsing or being surrounded, or the walls of this world are being surrounded by the enemy, then, and you have no money, then at that last minute, the Lord will provide a way, but you got to go. You got to walk out. If you don't have a car, you got to walk. But the Lord will provide the way then, because your heart is correct. But what I'm about to share with you today is so profound and fascinating, and is so important because not only is it fascinating, interesting, and profound, gripping truth that you've never heard before. That's another thing. You've never heard this before. There are pieces of this you may have heard before. Some have heard some of this before. Very little of it, but there's a lot more. And what we're going to do is put it together in gobs not just bits and pieces, but the whole gob. Put it all together. Now, I'm sure we're not going to be able to say everything that needs to be said in one video. We might do two, but the point is that this information not only is vast, but you've never been told, interesting, and you've never been told, fascinating, profound, but it is compelling, and it gives light and understanding to the world why we're here, what we're doing, the plan of salvation. And it is so interesting. It's almost like if somebody said, yeah, the plan today is we're all going to walk down to the park and sit at a picnic table and have lunch. You're like, oh, okay, that sounds good. All right, whatever. At least we're not going to the Gestapo beheading plank. But then if I told you, yeah, but here's what we're going to really do. We're going on a field trip to Yosemite National Park, and we're going to parachute down from the top, and we're going to float down to the river, and we're going to go fishing. We're going to see elk. We're going to ride horseback through the canyons. Now you're getting fascinating. Now you're getting compelling and interesting, and you're becoming one of my favorite people. Okay, so that's what this is going to be like. This is not just something true, something interesting, but this is so huge that you will be so surprised that no one's ever told you any of this. Very little bits and pieces, but not the meaning of any of this. It will explain everything. So we have to ask the question, when was English created and why? English. Why is it English? It has to do with angels? Well, it wasn't really invented, of course, not in some, one single moment, but it evolved about, I guess, probably over about 1,500 years. And it evolved when the Germanic tribes, and by the way, the Anglo language is a Germanic language. So these really are the Germans, the Germanic tribes. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes were the first. They migrated to Britain in around the 5th century. But when they got there, they needed this common language or common tongue in order to communicate, because they were different than the original Celtics that were there previously. So the Celtic peoples were already there, and the Druids. The language then evolved. It was like an organic evolution, but here is several key things. Old English was begun about 450 AD and developed over a period of about 600 years to about 1100 AD. That was kind of the foundational era. At that time, these invading tribes spoke Western Germanic dialects. They mixed with Old Norse from the Viking invaders. Now, the language was like a harsh, guttural language. Today, it would be completely you wouldn't be able to understand it. And you wouldn't be able to read it. But it did give us the foundation for words like be strong, water, different words. So around 1100, from 1100 to 1500 AD, after the Normans conquered the area, about 1066, French became the language of the ruling class. So the lower classes spoke English, and then they eventually merged, bringing thousands of French and Latin words into the language of the English. Words like beef and justice and other words. Now, early modern English, 1500 to 1800 AD, the great vowel shift changed how words were spoken. The invention of the printing press in about 1476, for instance, it forced some kind of a standardized spelling And the Renaissance brought in the science and the science vocabulary that we have, which is part of our language. And so from 1800 on, the Industrial Revolution came along. The British Empire expanded the language globally. And today the internet drives a rapid, quickly changing kind of a global integration. A lot of the words that we're adding are words like from Russian, and even we add some Chinese in there, phrases and things like that. So it's constantly changing and slang. But, all right, so they were Vikings. Some of them were Vikings. This is one of the ways that they would be described, right? What is a Viking? The word Viking is a job description, basically. It's not an ethnic label, but a job description. It originally meant pirate, believe it or not, or raider in the Old Norse. And, of course, Norse has to do with the North people, like Norwegian. So, in its original context, Viking referred to a person participating, it's a noun, in an expedition. And it's a feminine noun, so it referred to the activity itself, not to the people. So, to go Viking meant to set out on a voyage on a ship to raid and to trade, maybe, but a lot of raiding went on. They were raiders. Scholars debate the exact root of the word, but here are the theories. The bay theory. It's derived from the Old Norse word vik, which means inlet or creek or bay, water, But that would then suggest that the Viking was one of a group of people who were always in these little bays or coastlands. It's maybe a place where they launched their raids, right? Then there were the shifting rowers theory, derived from the Old Norse vika, meaning a sea mile or a shift down the river of rowers. So that links the name to the physical act of long distance rowing or boating or shipping, which would be for their expeditions. Then you've got the geographical theory, where Viken is an historical region around the Oslo Fjord in Norway. The North people, the Norwegians. Proponents argue that the first raiders known to the Europeans may have come from this area. The settlement theory, related to the Old English wick, or Latin vicus, and, then you've got the word witch and other words, but the meaning of vicus is village or camp. So that theory suggests the name referred to those who established temporary trading or raiding of people's camps. But whatever the original meaning, and there are certainly some of those original ideas that come from people on the sea and raiding others. We're going to find out here that there were two groups of people, but they just mingled, they merged. I would say Viking, Germanic tribes, most of them that were there originated from Dan, and another group that was the main corpus of the Israelites taken captive, the 10 tribes that were taken captive into Syria and went over the Caucasus Mountains and went up there, and at various times these individuals were there. Dan left on ships from Sidon and went up the places like through the Mediterranean, up the Danube, up to the Dansmark, and so forth. So you got those two groups that are basically the same people, and then you've got the descendants of Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea, or the Knights of St. John from the Languedoc, where Mary Magdalene and the 72 and John or Lazarus landed and became the first of the knights or the priests of the ancient Heliopolitan priesthood, now with the living king line of Jesus, the fishers of men. And these are the fishermen that went up later, around 800 AD. They were being driven out by the Holy Roman Empire. Germanic tribes drove out the Sephardic Jews, and around 800 they moved up into that area. And we'll find out about the fishermen as we go. And I know a lot of you are saying, no, wait a minute. You're saying that everybody, all the tribes and all the peoples have something to do with Israel. Everybody's Israel. You even think Genghis Khan was from the Israelites. Yeah. And the settlements in China and Japan. Shintoism, right? Buddhism was Ezekiel. And Zoroastrianism was Daniel. Shintoism is the religion of the Israelites when they trekked all the way across there and invaded Japan and created Shintoism. They have the two sticks, the priest holding it, white robe priest holding with two sticks the Ark of the Covenant, and they're called Sumerian or samurai priests. So remember, the Bible is the history book of all nations. The 72 souls that came out of the loins of Jacob, that came up out of Egypt. Moses led them out, and with two different groups, they conquered and colonized the world, became Galilee of the nations, or the circuit of the nations, and the mountains of Israel at the extremities of the world. So yes, all the world is Israel, all of it, and all of their history goes back to the Bible. The African history, the Chinese history, the Mesoamerican history, all goes back to the same stories that are in your Bible. But the Jewish individuals were the people who had the oracles, so they preserved them. They were the scribes, painstakingly, supposedly transcribing this history. But modern Jews, and remember, they're not real Jews. They're apostate. I mean, everybody's Israel, so they go back to Israel. Everybody does. But they are Ashkenazis, and they have no interest in Judaism or Christianity, other than they have determined that the Torah and the law, the lower version, the egotistical ways and the instinctual ways of the past, is what they want to keep us in and keep us under their control, scaring us with all of this evil, witches, and they're the ones who down through the centuries, when they took over the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic tribes, they made up this stuff where you're supposed to be scared of witches, and you're supposed to be scared of the ghost spell or the goth spells or the spells of the witches, which is the teachings of the true priesthood, the wizards. But this is where we're going to show you how they lied to us, and preserving all of this in the Brothers Grimm or the romance of King Arthur and all of that. Yes, preserved. They have to. They're not allowed to keep it from us. But it's written very opaque, and it's vague, and you really need the Holy Spirit to be able to understand this. It would be left to a latter day to put all this together. But they have the Catholic Church, the Germanic Holy Roman Empire, which is of the dark side, has taken away the knowledge of the original ways and teachings about what the gospel is, and the colonizing, and the eventually coming and making the Constitution. All of this, we don't know what really went on. We don't know why Shilago was built. We don't know any of this history, and this is where we're going to find out today what's really going on. We're going to find out who really did build Shilago and all these cathedrals that they claimed they built and then burned them down. And why there are both Gothic style buildings, like the one in Salt Lake that was there when they got there, we can prove, and the Athenian Greco buildings that were at Shilago and St. Louis and other places in the world. There were two groups here, the Vikings and the descendants of Mary Magdalene and the Knights of St. John. But this modern Jewry, which is a religion and not a race, we're not racist. All of us came from our mother Eve and Adam. We're all one race. But this religion of Judaism have tried to, and that's why the curse is put there. Whoever takes away or adds to the plagues that are written in this book shall be upon them. And that's exactly a prophecy. It's what's going to happen to them. But like we said the other day, we don't even have, supposedly, we don't have an original Septuagint. So we don't have the Bible. We've got versions of it. However, I do believe, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, just like the Nag Hammadi Library, it will be dug up in time and we will have the original, the entire sacred script. Somewhere it's being hidden down in the basement of the Vatican or something, but they don't want you to see it because it would blow their cover. But we do have it, and the Bible we have, we can easily go back to the Septuagint and pretty much divine the meaning of it. Nothing's lost because it was written in parables, so that those who see will not see, and those hearing will not hear, and they will not be repenting and be saved, right? Because they weren't worthy. They need to have the proper heart attitude. You need to pray and receive interpretation from the Holy Spirit. So this word Viking, it definitely became the word in their language that meant raiders. So the word appeared in Old English as Wising, as early as the 6th century to mean a pirate. It largely disappeared from use during the Middle Ages, was revived again in the 19th century when the Romantic era happened, and it described the entire Scandan Navy, the Navy culture of the early Middle Ages. So what does the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes mean? What's the etymology? Well, the name of the three, which were the three primary Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, each are tied to their ancestral homelands or some specific weapons that they would carry because they were raiders. They were all raiders. So Angles is what they say that the word angle means hook, which makes sense because an angle has a hook. A narrow hook, which they claim refers to the Anglian Peninsula in the modern day Germany. So it's from Germany, which resembles a fish hook. So they were fishermen. All right, they were fishermen because the Angles were the first people that were there. And then they later on, about 800, became Vikings or invaders and raiders. Well, that's because these are different groups. The Saxons were the warrior types. They had the knives, the seax, which is a short sword. They were soldiers, yes, and these soldiers were soldiers of Christ. So the Angles or the angels were the good guys, and they were the fishers of men, and they were the soldiers of Christ. But then they were overtaken and kind of, superseded by the Vikings and the Germanic tribes that were coming from the eastern part over the Caucasus Mountains and bringing with them the law of Moses and being very ugly and kind of stamping out that liberty and the gospel and changing the gospel they knew they couldn't change the gospel. They couldn't take our Bibles from us. But they could tell us that the word ghost spell was evil. They could tell us that a witch and a wizard was evil. And all of these things. We shouldn't cast spells. And they just think it was some kind of witchcraft. But what really casting a spell was simply as a fisherman casting your line. You were fishers of men and you were teaching, not indoctrinating. That's a harsh word. It literally meant the teaching and the expansion of the gospel, or the holy words that were received by the Druids, who were the knowers. Well, some of them, you've got different groups that were divided up in how they acted. But there's another word, Angles and Angles. Angle is a fishhook, but an Angles is an angel, right? Now, Then there's Saxon. The Saxon means a knife, a short sword, I guess. And it was named after the single-edged combat knife that they had, sax. And they carried it for war and for daily tasks, cutting branches and whittling. The Jutes, a Proto-Germanic utaz, it means giants. It meant the great ones. The name is the root of the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark, Dansmark, right? From the Danish, from the Danes. So the Jutes, we don't even use that word anymore. It's just gone out of circulation. They were the ones that were first there, and these are the Danes and from Dan that came up there, and these are a different group, different than the angels or the good guys, where they originated before they settled in Kent and the Isles of Wight. So England's name, the term England, Ingla land, is the land of the messengers of Christ, or the angels. We'll get to that. But they eventually became the dominant culture in this, up there in this territory in the north, the Norwegians. Saxons were in the English countries, and a lot of English countries today still have this Saxon root, like Essex, East Saxons, Sussex, South Saxons, Wessex, West Saxons, and Middlesex, which is the Middle Saxons. The Jutes were the first to settle under the leaders of Hengist and Horsa. Their name became pretty much disappeared. We don't really talk about them anymore. They were absorbed into the broader Anglo-Saxon identity. The fishers with knives. They were called fishermen for a reason, though, not just because they liked to fish. They were fishermen, but this was a title, basically, that goes back to Christ, the fisherman. Now, these individuals that we just generically called Viking at times, or were also called the barbarians. They are the very barbarians that we hear about, that Julius Caesar spoke about, all the way back to Julius Caesar. There were people that were up there and they were called barbarians. So we've been talking about Vikings and Anglo-Saxons and so forth, and they were there after Christ. So this is 400 AD. But now these barbarians were there in the days of Julius Caesar, 30 BC and before, because that's the group that came over the Caucasus Mountains from Assyria that were taken into captivity in 720 BCE. So for 700 years, they were migrating up over the Caucasus Mountains, up through Russia and into the Norwegian, or the North area. But they were Celtic peoples then. And they actually hired the Vikings as mercenaries. That's who they were. So they were raiders as mercenaries. But while the Anglo-Saxons were soldiers and they were fishermen, they weren't invaders or mercenaries in that negative sense. That was the group that came in, the Vikings, and that's from Dan. Dan was in the ships, and that's the Vikings. And they came in to fight certain other peoples that were causing them trouble. But then later on, they stopped paying them, these mercenaries, and they literally took them over, and they took over the Celts, and they became raiders. So they were barbarians or invaders, the Vikings of Dan's group. But they're not the Anglo-Saxons, even though they had knives and of course they weren't the type of weapons that you would use to fight a war. They were short swords. They used them as pocket knives, basically. They weren't that big. But they could defend themselves with them. And they were giants. And that didn't necessarily mean they were criminals, though. I mean the Vikings. They were from Dan. They certainly had a false religion because Dan brought idolatry and the law of Moses, the Levitical priests, that started the governments. And he superimposed this idolatrous form of Judaism into that whole area to the point where they conquered the Anglo-Saxons and they all became Vikings. But it didn't mean they were all evil. It meant that they were stuck in this government mindset that came down from Dan. They were mercenaries. They were soldiers. They were brought in from the Mithraic culture, which we'll get to, because they were Israelites, so they were taken in captivity in Syria. At least the group that came from the Caucasus Mountains that were from the BC, the original barbarians, as they were called, which mixed then with these Vikings. And so there was both of these things competing. The original Israelite religion, which probably recognized the feminine and all of that, it wasn't so bad. But Dan was that idolatrous religion of Judaism that was established, as you can read about in Joshua and Judges. And, because Dan married, Delilah and so forth, the Phoenician Canaanite religion, which was just more, carnal in nature. The lower frequencies. So these original people there, the barbarians as they were called, were the true Israelites that had been taken captive in 600, 700 BC. And they crossed the Caucasus Mountains and became what we know as the barbarians or the original peoples there. And then later on, we got the Vikings that came in. The Danes or the Danites or the Tuatha De Danann. So the Angles, the Saxons, were not criminals that were fleeing Rome. They were somebody who lived outside the borders of the Roman Empire, but they didn't speak Greek or Latin. So these peoples that they call the Vikings were going in there for different reasons. They weren't coming there to murder anybody, but they were going there for financial reasons. And so the tribes moved towards Britain for economic reasons and survival reasons. And also because in those days the climate was changing, that their northern European homelands, which would be modern Denmark and Germany, began flooding and their crops wouldn't grow. So they needed a more fertile, rich land, some farmland. So they chose Britain. They were invited mercenaries. They were invited there to do this. After the Roman legions left Britain, about 410, remember, about 405, these northern Germanic tribes, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Lombards and the Herlus and the Vandals, they were called Vandals. They would steal. Well, it might have felt like they were vandals, and they probably were, and thieves, and had knives, but they were also fishermen, and they were also mercenaries. They were highly trained mercenaries in spiritual things that we'll get to. So if they were vandals, they were probably following the law of Moses and vandalizing people that were the enemy, supposedly, not just vandalizing innocent people. But native Britons then became defenseless against these northern raiders who were the Picts and the Scots. The British king, whose name you might have heard, Vortigern, invited the first Angles and the Saxons to Britain to work as mercenaries. And then once they realized how weak and defenseless the Britons were, the mercenaries sent word home that the land was ripe for the picking. They eventually stopped working for the Britons and began a full-scale invasion, and then they established their own kingdom. Now, that may sound pretty cruel, but this, as you'll see, was their modus operandus. They were the Israelites. They went and conquered just like they did the Promised Land, using the law of Moses. So the idea of giants comes from how the Anglo-Saxons viewed the ruins that the Romans left behind. There were these huge ruins. They were a society that they had several tribes. They were built with wood and thatch. They saw massive stone aqueducts and brick baths and all these huge buildings that were built by the Romans, and they couldn't believe humans made it, so they called them giants. So these were Roman ruins. And when you come to America and you see all the mounds over here, the mound builders, that's who these were. They were early Vikings in this country. They were Israelites. They were raiders. They were conquerors. They literally came on the boat with Joseph of Arimathea, and that's what we're going to get into. So I believe King Arthur, was all over the place, but the whole King Arthur romance stories centers around France. But remember, in our mind over here in America, we're thinking France is completely different. Germany, they're a long ways away. They're totally different countries. But France and Germany were full of these Germanic tribes. And Britain and all of this is right there. It's one very small country. It'd be like people in New York that knew the people in Louisiana. They're all just one continent, one mass. But King Arthur, and now Arthur is Arctic. We've got Arcturus in the sky. It's in the north, a North Star. It's about the north, the Norwegians, right? Norway. And these were Danes, and this is Danmarks, and the Danube, and the Danister, and all of this, the Sweden, and the Jordan. They started from the Jordan in Sedan, got on boats, and followed the rivers and the lakes and the oceans, and got to Danmark, and this is where the Danes were. So I believe that the basic romantic stories of Avalon came from France. However, King Arthur went all the way up to Britain. And so there are stories in France about King Arthur up in Britain. So the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes were Vikings. And they were mercenaries. And they were headed up by the tribe of Dan, who was also of Judah. Dan had a mother that was of the line of Judah and a father of the line of Dan. And Dan married Delilah, who was a Greek seafaring tribe, as well as Dan, who dwelt in ships. So they had boats, just like the Vikings. And everywhere they went on their boat, they named it after Dan. It wasn't just Dan. They took with them the law of Moses. They had a golden calf. They were idolaters, just like the Jews. They had, in fact, the kind of Judaism that we have today is really by the Judaism of Dan, which was an apostate form of Judaism, which was idolatry, which was the golden calf, which was the Levitical priesthood, because they brought Levites with them up to Dan on the ship. And whenever they went, they took their government with them, the laws of Moses. So they went to London, Sweden, the Donbass, and the Dnieper, and so on and so forth. So the earliest mention of King Arthur was around 828 AD, a little bit after the earliest times. And that would place him in Britain, which is after the Roman Britons in a desperate defense against the invading Saxons. Period. Then you had the French influence. And so the French, much of that chivalry and the romance associated with Arthur, the Round Table, Lancelot, the Holy Grail, was created around the Languedoc, southern France, where Mary Magdalene went with John, and this is where we get the Knights of St. John, and this is where we get the priesthood, or the Knights of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. He brought the 72, which is the Sanhedrin that started this government. And so this government then was the government of Christ. Now, the other group was from the Assyrians being taken over, is by the Israelites that were taken into Assyria and went over the Caucasus Mountains. So there was two groups that went there. One that were taken captive 700 BC were there already. And then the other group that we are calling the Vikings or the Danes or the Dansmark or the tribe of Dan that migrated up there and met the earlier group, the barbarians. And then we got the third group. So there are three different groups, and they're all Israelites. The descendants of Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea in this group, they went to the Ireland, brought with them a royal bloodline from Heliopolis, Tia Tifi. Jeremiah actually went there years and years before that, if you read the book of Jeremiah, and brought the holy seed from a daughter of Jeconiah. And so there was two different royal bloodlines. There was the Perez, the Judean Perez, and then there was the red hand or the Zara line, which we'll get into, which is Zoroastrianism, Zara and Esther. All of the world is about Israel, not because nobody cared about any other nation, only the Israelites, but because all the nations are Israel. And the story about the Israelites going into captivity just meant that they went, like for instance, when they went into Babylon, the Jews went to Babylon, they went to a brother or sister nation. Nebuchadnezzar was a descendant of Solomon and Bathsheba. He was a royal czar, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebo was a deity or a descendant of Nimrod, but also married in through Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba became Nebuchadnezzar. So they were interested in the royal bloodline. They brought the royal seed to Babylon, and they made their house in Babylon. And that became the first world power. Well, the first of the evil world powers, the actual first world power was King David in Egypt, at Karnak and Luxor, Egypt, and Heliopolis. It was the biggest world empire that the world's ever seen. And to this day, Karnak is the biggest metropolis in the world, with temples and city and buildings and all of this. And the government of King David and Solomon is the ideal that all the world tries to mimic. So we have Caesar, the Khazars, Ahasuerus, right? Xerxes. All of these were different spellings of the same Osiris, the original Osiris of Egypt, which is Zerah, the line of Zerah, who named himself after the original Osiris, who is Nimrod. So, if you don't know who Nimrod is, he was the son of Cush. And so, yeah, Nimrod built Babel, but he also, his brother, or his father, Cush, was Ethiopia. So all of, not just Egypt, but Ethiopia, which meant Africa, were the children of Ham. And they were the world rulers. Nimrod, Cush had the garment of Adam, the royal priesthood, and Nimrod, his son, wore it. Esau of Abraham murdered him, beheaded him. We've talked about all of that. So the chivalry was French. And you've got the French poets like Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century that wrote about these romantic King Arthur novels. Avalon is associated with Glastonbury, England, which was where the first Christian church was made in 63 AD, by the way. And legends link Avalon to Brittany, which is northern France. So it started in France. It was settled by Britons fleeing the Saxons. So, were the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes Vikings? Not exactly. They all came from the same general Germanic stock. They existed in different eras. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded Britain in the 5th century. 410. The Viking Age didn't truly begin until the 8th century, about 300 years later, but they were the same basic people that remained. They were mercenaries, and early Saxons and Jutes arrived as mercenaries. They were hired by the Britons, and then later on they turned into invaders or mercenaries, and later on they turned into invaders. So they were cousins. The Angles and the Jutes lived in what is now Denmark, and then they migrated. But the Danes, who became the Vikings, moved into that empty land after the Angles left for Britain. The tribe of Dan migrated to Europe. They named all of their settlements like Denmark, London, the Daniper, Lundan in Sweden, the rivers Don, Dnieper, Danube. These are Proto-Indo-European root words, Danu, and it means, they claim today, it means a river or flowing water. But remember, it means water because they were seafaring, sailors. This is where we get all of the hard, cruel prison systems, the armies and war and all those kinds of laws from the laws of Moses from Dan, which is the apostate version of Judaism. But then we also have the government of Christ, the fishermen. And this is where we get maritime law. Mary is the group that came from France, who came with the 72, the Knights of St. John. They then went to the world to conquer the world, and they put down the laws of Mary. And this is why water has to do with Mary, and this is why all the world is under the maritime law, because it is the law of the apostles, which in the old Greek language meant admiral, which meant the rulers just under the king, right? They were ambassadors for the king, and that would be King Jesus, of course. They went to faraway lands on boats. They were fishermen, like Joseph of Arimathea. They conquered the world in the name of Christ, and this is why we've got a mix of the Viking, the Israelites that took the law of Moses, which would be the tribe of Dan, and started the vicious, hard Viking barbarians that met up with their brothers from Christ, the Knights of St. John, Joseph of Arimathea, who brought the kingdom of Christ, and they were the good people. And they've been mixing their government for the last 1,000 years. And finally, and they tried to murder them, and they left from Scotland and the Isle of Man all the way to Nova Scotia and to the Virginia area, the Carolinians, and they established the 13 colonies and then made the Constitution of liberty and justice for all because they were being murdered and wiped out. And the Vikings were after them. So in America, there were originally Vikings that settled, and there were later on, just a little bit later, the descendants of Christ and Mary Magdalene came over here to build the New Jerusalem. They made the Constitution. And so this is why when they came, they built Chalago, which is more of a Athenian style, Roman Greco style. But there were also, that temple that the Mormons supposedly built in Salt Lake was already there when they got there. So we've got pictures with just drawings of the temple back to 1853. And so a lot of people jump on that and say, see, but those are drawings that the architects drew up, but there is no, as far as I know, there are really no pictures of the Salt Lake Temple before 1893 that was finished. There's a couple of pictures, like one in 1892, but it wasn't finished. They were put in the steeple. But you see, here's the smoking gun. Notice that they say that when they started doing the renovations, there was this layer of 16 feet. It's actually not true. I looked it up, and AI says it's actually 35 feet they dug down, and there's rooms and built huge rocks and massive stones that go down under that temple 35 feet. And you can see part of it there when they did the excavations. They didn't go all the way down. They only went down about 14 to 16 feet. But it actually goes down 35 feet. Now, here's the interesting thing. Recently, when they renovated the Capitol in Washington, you saw the same thing. They dug down like about a story or 2 stories deep, about the same thing here. And you could still see going and going and going underneath the Capitol. It goes down, you see. Well, now hold on. What's this Tartarian mud flood thing where they're showing these buildings all over Europe, all over the world, that they all have a couple of stories underground? A lot of them. At least we've seen a lot of pictures. So I asked AI, is that something that they did? That they originally just built like this huge 2-story basement on all these magnificent, huge cathedral-like buildings? And they said no. The only thing that was ever done is they would build half the first story underground and the other half above ground, and that way they'd have some windows that could shine in there. But that's not what we see. And if that is truly, and AI just told me it is, 35 feet beneath the ground, it would be impossible. I don't believe, I mean, they would have been lying then because they didn't say they did that. Nobody ever said, when this Tartarian theory is going around with the mud flood, ain't nobody, architects or scientists coming along saying, now, wait a minute, guys. The reason for that is because all the buildings were built that way, and they built 2 stories, 3 stories down. Nobody's saying that because they didn't. They did not do it. They only built half a story down. And you see these buildings with almost all of these big buildings have these stairways going up to get to the first floor. So the first floor is usually above ground, not beneath ground. And so none of this makes any sense. If these stones that they put underground, 2 stories, or 3 stories, 35 feet, if it was just for foundational purposes, there wouldn't be windows and doors and walkways, and it wouldn't be 3 stories. That's ridiculous. You'd only need a massive rock, maybe 3 feet, 10 feet. You wouldn't need anything like more than 4 or 5 feet of stone. And if you're going to raise the first floor up so you got to walk up to it, then you really don't need any foundational stones underground. It's all a big lie. The Capitol in Washington, the Salt Lake City Temple, the other Mormon temples you find down in St. George and Manti and different places around the country, they're massive cathedrals, like Gothic style. Why would Brigham Young make a Gothic style temple? What is he, a Viking? Why didn't he follow the same principles that we look at all the courthouses all across America? The Greco style, the Latin or, the round dome pillar Greek Roman style buildings. But no, they wanted to do the Gothic style. And that is exactly what we're talking about here. So no, we don't have pictures proving that the Salt Lake Temple was there. Although in 1853, they did have cameras. It's funny, something that extraordinary they were building. And there were thousands of Mormons all over the place and tourists and people coming through. And nobody ever took a picture. Any of those pictures were ever taken, they've been scrubbed off the internet. I guarantee it. I personally do not believe that a group of, farmers went out to Salt Lake and in a couple of years, about 40 years, actually probably 30 years time, they built this massive temple that is 35 feet higher than it is seen today because it goes underground. This is crazy. That is a Gothic style Germanic temple. And there are a lot of those that were in the western part of the United States. And the Vikings were predominant in that area. They've even found Viking tools and implements and stuff in the ground. But Chalago and the major civilization was done by John, St. John, who went to Asia, went to Africa, went to America, and established the kingdom of Christ for 1,000 years. And it's real. We've been lied to about all of that, the Tartarians and stuff. So, while it does mean river, and they were on the river, they were seafaring men, it also means Dan, because Dan means the river people, the seafaring boat people. So Dan's mark comes from the Danes, or Dan, and that's where his mark is. It's the borderland or the forest land. Lundan is they claim it's a pre-Celtic word, Londinium, and possibly could mean the place of the bold one, or where the river that floods. But this is only speculation, because you have to start wondering about this word Dan when it ends up at the end of everything, like Swedan and the Jordan and Siddan. We know that Dan started in Siddan, where he married Delilah in Tyre, and the Jordan later on became known as the Jordan. Remember, Jordan means a rushing river, and it was named after Dan. So yeah, Dan means a rushing river or water, and they were seafaring. So they went from Siddan and went to the Dan's mark. That is, I believe, very clear. Now, you might think the Jutes were Jews, and it's possible, but very unlikely. The Jutes were a Germanic people from the Jutland, or the Denmark area. So they were Jews, or Israelites. But the word Jute is more of an Old Norse word. But whether it comes from the word Jew, we're not sure. So the Anglos and the Saxons and the Jutes, they weren't criminals. They might have been originally prisoners. They were taken captive. Well, not the Anglo-Saxons, but the other barbarian groups that go all the way back to BC that were predating the Vikings into Assyria. So they were originally criminals. But they also were taught the Mithric religion, which is the religion of the Magi, which came from Zoroaster, who was Daniel. He was the head of the Magi. And in the very same year, about 600 BC, that the historical Zoroaster was. Zoroaster is Zerah, the line of Zerah of the Jews, mixed with Queen Esther. And Queen Esther married who? Ahasuerus, who is this Zerah, right? Of the other line of the Jews. Not the Perez line, but the Zerah line. So, if you've ever heard where Jesus said, were there no widows in Israel? Because Elijah went to the woman of Zarephath. Well, that's Zarabeth, or the city of Zerah. And that was up in Syria, up by Tyre and Sidon. And Dan mixed with them, mixed with Delilah. So they were elite warriors. They learned this religion. They had this, what we call masonry, and spiritual things that they learned from becoming diviners. Like Daniel was a diviner. They had visions. They could interpret dreams. They heard the whisper. We'll get into that. So they were highly specialized, elite warriors known as the Foederati, which is the allied fighters, the Foederati. After the Roman legions withdrew from Britain, 410, as we said, the local leaders, the Romano-Britons, they didn't have any army of their own, and they were being raided by the Picts and the Scots. So they hired the Germanic tribes, because they were already famous in Europe and had fought the toughest fights. They'd been fighting like warriors all the way from hundreds of years BC, making their way through across the Caucasus Mountains to become the Caucasians. But the Roman citizens by this time refused to fight. They were untrained. that this is about the end of the Roman Empire, 400, because 405 the Vikings destroyed the Roman Empire. And then about 800, they started the Holy Roman Empire, which was a Germanic empire. So it was no more Latin. They hired the Germanic mercenaries, which is a Roman strategy, which is what caused their downfall, because the people got very lazy and lying around in luxury and satin sheets. They got demoralized, and they hired the Vikings, the barbarians, for their warriors, and then they took them over. The people that were there before, they were called giants, the Jutes. And we don't even know who they are, because we don't even have a people today called Jutes, really. It's kind of gone out of vogue, but they were called then giants, or they were also called mound builders. But it wasn't because they were giants, although they were very tall, over 6 feet tall, 6'6", 6'7", so they were giants. I mean, my mother is from Ireland, and her father was 6 something. They were always tall. So they were tall. The Danes were very tall. And some of the shorter people from Europe, the Romans, thought they looked like giants, because they were usually only about 5'2" or 3, 5'5" at the most. And these were 6'5" giants. So they were giants, and they were mound builders. They practiced cremation, and they had these burial mounds. That's why you find them here in America. Those burial mounds, the Native American Indians don't even know what they are. They were here before them. So, later generations, when they came along, they found these massive burial heaps. They believed that they were graves from some ancient race of giants. And they were, but, within reason, about 6'5", 6'6". There could have been some of them 7 foot tall. To this very day, and the white race genetics is becoming not so pure anymore. They've mixed so much with the Slavic peoples and peoples from the south that they're no longer 7 feet tall. Most Europeans are around 6'3" now, at the most, 6'2", 6 foot. They've shrunk, but they used to be very tall. So, they called it the work of the giants. So the people that went there later on felt like they were little small people, like elves and stuff. They talk about the little people. And they were little people compared to the giants that had lived there before and built the mounds. But remember, they were the people of Dan, and that included all the Israelites. They were Judahites, Danites, Levites, and a remnant of all the children of Israel that went with Dan. They had a naval presence in the world. They were very skilled. That was their greatest asset. They didn't just have boats, but they had deep sea rowing vessels. They could go anywhere. They could cross the Pacific. They did. They were here in America. They made the mounds. They weren't Vikings yet, but that label came later on for the Danes and the Norwegians. So the word Norwegian means north wayer, a person from the North Way. That's from the Old Norse Nordviger, which refers to the sea route along the Atlantic coast, or the Skandan Navy, which led north. So the Norway people and other Scandinavians from Dan, nations like Danemark, Sweden, were named after specific tribes of Danes, or the children of Israel, the Danites. So the Old Norse words norver, north, and vigor, way or root, is where you get the north root or way, the Norway, the Norwegian, vigor. So they were Northmen, the Nordmen. So this comes from the root be nor. An Old Norse word for narrow is another way it's come down to us. The narrow waterways, the fords, and the geography developed all these words. Where they lived, the peninsulas and the fords and the bays and the peninsula, all this. So they became known as Norwegians. So when was this apostasy? Well, as I said, about 400, the Vikings took Rome and made the Holy Roman Empire. And it wasn't long after that, they were changing the Bible. They took the name of deity out of the Bible, Theos, which is higher consciousness, divine mind. They took that out and replaced it with Godin. The Lombards worshiped Godin. And it was the tribe called the Lombards that said Godin that of the 10 Germanic tribes took Italy. And so they were the one that basically took over the church in a real way, Rome. And the rest of the Vikings, depending on where they were, they had different slang. They would say Woden or Odin. Lombards called it Godin. That got into our Bible. We are now worshiping God or Godin, who is an ancestor of the Vikings. Yeah, he's an Israelite. Yeah, he's an ancient hero. But it isn't the true deity. And we don't want to be idolaters, as that word has come down to us. So, John Dee and Edward Kelly had sort of a seance. They were the first ones to call the British Empire. They wanted it to sound big. And they would contact not the Lord, but the evil lower spirits. And it was that lower spirit that they was communicating with him. And the spirit wouldn't even let them have that knowledge or let them become great unless they would sacrifice their own children and get involved in orgies. So John Dee would sleep with Edward Kelly's wife, and Edward Kelly had to sleep with John Dee's wife, and they started swapping wives. This group came over into New York from the York individuals and the York rites of this Masonry, which was a corrupted version, and they started the Cochranites in Maine, Massachusetts, and Upper New York. It was the population at that time, other than the 13 colonies, which were, of course, from the Union Jack or Jacob, from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But the York Rite were all polygamous. Brigham Young came from the York Rite. He was a Cochranite. He had several wives before he even met Joseph Smith. Soon as he came in synchronized and coordinated with Albert Pike, who was changing the whole Scottish Rite into some 33 degrees, and they were going to indoctrinate the whole world into this evil. The John Dee Edward Kelly Satanism and the swapping of wives, the evil, and the Jacob Frank group of these Jews and the Illuminati, and they infiltrated the Masons. They came over. Now, Benjamin Franklin was of the good people, the French Illuminati, from the Huguenots back to, Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. So that's why they got the Constitution through, because of Benjamin Franklin and the true liberty and fraternity of the government of France. But alongside them was these Cochranite, lying, evil, wicked Vikings that had now become apostate through John Dee and Edward Kelly and the British Empire, and they were going to stop the rebuilding of the New Jerusalem by Joseph Smith, who was appointed and ordained by a Sephardic Jewish individual, Abraham Jonas, who was a disciple of Benjamin Franklin. They were establishing the Constitution. They appointed Joseph Smith to build the New Jerusalem and go to the west and to the Rocky Mountains and build up the kingdom of deity in the heights of the mountains of Israel, the extremity of the earth, to build Mount Zion, the kingdom of the Lord. So Brigham Young, a Cochranite polygamist, went in with some individuals that we've talked about before. They murdered Joseph Smith. They persecuted the leaders of the church that were trying to build the New Jerusalem. They lied about Joseph Smith being a polygamist. They murdered him in cold blood. He became a martyr for Christ. And they trekked to Salt Lake knowing that that temple was already there. It's a Viking Gothic building. It wasn't from the Union Jack, from the Jacob group that was in the eastern part of the America. But Joseph Smith was going to the western part to establish the kingdom of Christ. So there was then a war, and they've been trying to destroy the Constitution since then. They've taken over and infiltrated our government. They bought and paid for by the Rothschild money, Jacob Frank money, the Illuminati. They've established the Holy Wood or Hollywood to make the idols and the rock and roll music, throwing up the devil sign. Anton LaVey, the Levite from the old Norse Law of Moses, which back in those days it was okay. They had to conquer the world. They had laws. It was a tool. It didn't have to be evil. It didn't have to be genocide, you see. It could have been to go in and teach. But it's just that they were conjuring up the lower energies and misunderstanding and not yet learning their lessons. So they created the Hollywood and they cast the spell on the masses. Now, remember, this just means to teach. But they indoctrinated not the way of the Lord with the gospel, but they indoctrinated and cast the spells of Satan. They channeled, they were mediums, this is why they created the tell-a-lies of the vision. This is why they made the media, which was the medium of this evil in certain channels. This is why, to this day, Elon Musk is trying to create technocracy, because they know all this is true. They're literally duped into thinking that they're creating the technocracy or the technology, which is the final kingdom of the Lord. But they're like the other Enoch who built the city that was material. They're materialists. Their craft is Freemasonry, which isn't free at all. They took it over. It was infiltrated by the Illuminati. Adam Weishaupt, a Jew, and Jacob Frank, and the Rothschild money. So it was secret technology. You'll read about a lot of this from Manly P. Hall, which was, by the way, not a good person. He was definitely one of these guys like Anton LaVey, and they were working for the dark side, like Aleister Crowley. So we're way over. I just can't keep on going. We're going to have to finish this tomorrow. We're almost an hour and a half. I'm very sorry about that. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, and we're going to do the rest of this tomorrow. We're just forming the foundation, the historical foundation for all of this information. What I'm going to share with you tomorrow is going to literally blow your mind. When you find out what's really going on in this world and who's running it and why, and the fight between good and evil, the sons of light and the sons of darkness, you've got to watch tomorrow's video. And please share this with every man, woman, and child you can. Because this is the information that will bring salvation to those that hear it. Yeah, there might be a lot of people at first that won't want to hear it, that won't understand it. They're indoctrinated into the ways of the laws of Moses and the ways of this world. And they will be frightened when you talk about the gospel as a ghost spell. They will be frightened about the fact that our ancestors were witches and wizards. But it's because they need to hear the truth. They've been lied to, and we've got to tell them. So let's stop there, and we'll pick it up right here tomorrow. And we're going to go into the Glastonbury Legends, which is the first church in 63 AD of Christ Jesus. And we're going to go into the ruins and the secret whispers and the Druids and all the most amazing and fantastic and interesting and profound things you've never heard. We'll see you guys tomorrow. You know the Lord loves you very much. His grace and His peace will always be with you. Have a good one, friends.